everyone. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's 9 minutes past the hour. We apologize for the slight delay. We had some hiccups with the Zoom invite, but we're happy that Richard is here now, and we're happy you're here. So for those who don't know, this is the third event for the AI for Global Climate Cooperation Initiative. This is a talk of Richard Socher. We're so happy he's here. So just very briefly, if you don't know about the competition yet, I encourage you to go to www.ai4climatecoop.org. There you'll find a lot of information about the initiative that is the motivation for doing all these talks. So this is the third talk. The first two talks were with Yosha Benjo and Chris DeWitt. Those talks are online on YouTube now, so if you're interested, please go take a look. The format for today is first we'll have a discussion with Richard for about 20 minutes, and since we're starting a bit late, maybe we'll cut it down to 15 minutes, and then we'll have audience questions. So as we're just talking a little bit about the role of AI and economics and climate change, please think of some questions that you want to ask Richard, and then after the initial 15 minutes, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself when we let you unmute you, and to ask your question, and or you can use the Q&A box in Zoom to ask your questions, and then I can ask them to Richard too. We'll record this meeting. We'll be able to see it later on YouTube. So yeah, everyone who can't make it can see it. Okay, so that was housekeeping. So let's get to Richard. So I'm very delighted he's here. Just to tell you just a little bit about Richard, he got his PhD from Stanford in 2014, working on deep learning for NLP, and was really one of the people in the vanguard, I would say, trying to get people to get into the new age of machine learning. So from 2014 to 16, he then created MetaMind, a startup that was taking that AI technology into the real world. That was acquired by Salesforce, where he then was chief scientist from 2016 to 2021. And that's also where I met Richard and I got to work with him. And in 2021, last year, he then decided to go back to his entrepreneurial roots. He now works on building U.com. So if you haven't tried that, yeah, you can see the logo. It's a new generation search engine. It's very exciting. And he's also an investor. So he's one of the founding partners of AI4GCC Ventures. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. And if you haven't followed Richard, he's a paramotoring fan. So he has a lot of energy. So let's get that energy into the room today. So yeah, let's kick off with like this theme of today, which we want to have a conversation about the potential and challenges of using artificial intelligence to inform us about climate change, climate cooperation, and a bit more generally about sort of economic decision making. And so, Richard, just first question. In this competition, we talk a lot about simulations and deep learning and reinforcement learning. Why do you think that is an important framework for modeling cooperation and climate change?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for coming, everyone. Really excited to be here. Looks like we got a good couple of attendees. I look forward to your questions and having a conversation later. I think at a very high level, AI has had obviously a ton of impact on different fields, but not, it always in retrospect looks so obvious of why it should have worked. But when you're in the trenches in the very beginning, it actually is very hard and it feels like it may never work. And so I've seen this myself when I tried to get neural networks and deep learning into natural language processing. And I had some very famous senior, highly cited professors sort of scream at me with their heads red, literally at conferences, saying how little it would make sense to map an entire vector into a single vector representation, and how none of that made sense, how neural networks didn't make sense, and how they were the stuff that didn't work in the 90s. My papers got rejected from conferences because people just didn't read past the abstract of it's a neural network that has this like great performance, and they're like, whatever, it doesn't matter because neural networks don't work. And so in the moment, in the beginning of these, it often looks very hard. And then you have to think about, okay, well, why do I keep pushing for this? Why do I have this conviction that this is the right approach to things? And you have to actually really go from first principles and think about like why that approach has certain advantages and maybe disadvantages, right? One of the disadvantages of deep learning and neural networks, and I think reinforcement learning to similar but slightly different degree, but partially even more so when it's deep reinforcement learning, is that they need more data, right? And so they weren't the right approach in the 90s. If you just wanted to build a system that does something in that moment, it wasn't the right approach to use a neural network because there wasn't that much data. But then you have to think from first principles, plus the trends that you see in the world. And the trends that you see in the world are there is going to be more and more data available. And so the right approaches are those that can actually use that data very well and then learn themselves with very few assumptions. And so to now bring it to reinforcement learning works well when you have incredibly good simulations. And deep reinforcement learning, well, if you have good simulations and you can ground those simulations in a ton of data. And so I think we're starting here something truly foundational. And if I was a PhD student now and I was to think about, okay, how do I have a lot of impact? I would go and not probably think about yet another variant of the transformer, because I do think ultimately you're going to have these large general function approximators that will do well. But I would think about a field that hasn't yet had that huge impact that deep learning, AI, reinforcement learning can have, and then actually try to disrupt that field. And obviously, that field is not computer vision anymore. It's not natural language processing. It's not biology, because even in biology, a lot of folks have already now started to train massive large language models for training proteins and so on. But it is economics. And just like in linguistics, economics has sort of a couple of more traditional senior researchers in the field who know a set of tools and mathematical tools, statistical tools, programming tools, and so on, that they've built their careers from and built their citation counts for and their reputation and so on. And a lot of those folks will not like a massive amount of change. But concretely here, I think it's up to young folks who see the potential. And now just to bring it really to your question as a long arc, but the potential here is immense. One of the biggest problems for sustainability is the fact that it's not always the most economically obvious. It is sort of in the very long term, but an immediate quarterly term that a lot of companies are on and organizations are on, at best yearly, sort of planning cycles. It isn't often the perfectly right thing to do. Governments can think about, sort of 4-year time horizons often, if they're, voted every 4 years in governments and so on. And then there are a few governments who really think way beyond that. And are trying to push that. And so when you have these competing priorities, you want to be able to basically give them tools to help them show that, what the right solution is. And in the face of a lot of uncertainty and a vast amount of options that you have, and the action space being extremely large, ideally you can run these simulations. And I think sustainability is one example. Our first paper, the AI Economist, is a similar and related example where instead of having these thousands and thousands of years of bloodshed that we've seen in humanity, to try to figure out an equitable model for societies to be productive and for overall productivity to increase, people have fought over that. Communism, socialism, just in the last 100 years. And obviously capitalism and social market capitalism, new ideas that came about, in the last 100 years, and then were incorporated into newer constitutions and countries that were formed later, such as Germany. You see the struggle and you see the attempts. And so if you could build a really realistic simulation, and that's a big if, similar to what we see with large language models, it's a big if that you can train a multi-billion parameter model. And you need to have a lot of infrastructure, you need to do a lot of engineering, and you need to get people together to actually make that happen. But if you can get over those big engineering hurdles, then you can really build a model that is incredibly useful. And I think that is what we're seeing exactly now here with this climate challenge, also with the AI economist and these ideas in general of using two-level reinforcement learning models to capture things. And it is an incredibly complex task to try to build a simulation that is actually realistic enough, right? And then once it is realistic enough, then you can really start, and it's ideally grounded in a lot of data, then you can really start to use it to get better outcomes.
Right. Right, and as you said, building realistic simulations and then trying to understand the climate change problem is it is a tough problem, right? So maybe can you elaborate a little bit more on like some sort of technical aspects, because you've worked with a lot of deep learning and we've worked on reinforcement learning together, right? So what are some of the main sort of technical challenges you think that people should focus on when they do this problem, when they study this problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a really big one is a little bit structured around the incentives that we see too, right? A lot of PhD students try to just publish like every quarter, like a solid paper, and then get to their PhD eventually. They, in theory, have the luxury to work on something for 2 or 3 years and then have one epic paper. But the truth is that you get nervous after a year or two of not publishing anything, even if you think you're making progress towards a bigger goal. But I think it's a huge technical challenge to actually incorporate a ton of real life data into these models, and getting like past economic data as data points, then actually make the simulation realistic enough, and bring in the various distributions that you have, and then think through the various assumptions that you might make about how people's utility function is shaped, how much would they want to work, what are their motivations, and this goes like pretty deeply philosophical and sort of fundamentally human very quickly. It's like some people think that a lot of humans are just self-motivated. There's all kinds of psychology that goes into these assumptions, and you need to make them realistically and ideally with reasonable sort of distributions that you go in terms of priors in the beginning of these simulations. And then, of course, it's a huge technical challenge because right now, reinforcement learning is still not at a place where it's easy to run, a 10,000 agent model, even 100, and like let alone a million agent model. But ultimately, if you want to model even a realistically sized country, you need to get at least a few million. And then if you have a few million like learning agents that are maximizing their utility functions, which have all kinds of interesting emergent behavior, and then you really have realistic baseline data about the economy, realistic assumptions about some of the basics of human psychology, then you can run a simulation that will ultimately give you real insights. And I think a lot of countries, maybe not the US, where it's a lot of identity politics and whatnot, and sort of super PACs and special interest groups and all of that, that govern a lot of politics. But in countries like Singapore, that is sort of a very benevolent, but not fully democratic sort of setup. But they're structuring things incredibly well, and they're running their country incredibly well along a lot of dimensions. They are going to try to just identify what is the objectively best thing to do to maximize their objective functions. And the objective functions that we started with were, equality and productivity of the economy overall, but you can add sustainability very easily in this. You can program into the simulation tragedy of the commons and other kinds of issues, and then have that simulation kind of give you good answers that are possibly even implementable as is for one set, for one system and for one country.
Mm-hmm. Right, and so what I'm hearing is part of what makes this methodology convincing, or these results convincing, is sort of realism, and making sure there's some sort of alignment with what a non-technical audience wants or expects, right? But and like just going back a little bit to your own background and trying to convince people in natural language processing that deep learning is the way to go. like what are some sort of strategies to convince them, right? Like, I mean, obviously there's the, let's just show better results because you have some benchmarks and then you show that your neural network can do much better than whatever else came before. But if you think about this climate change simulation, what kind of metrics do you think you need to show people, or what other qualities do you think you need to show people to convince them that this is the way to go?
It's a great question, and honestly, it's a really hard system because you have to acknowledge that in any line of research, there are usually people who have an interest in the field improving, but not improving or changing so much that their past research is now irrelevant. And you see this in economics, and you see this in a lot of other places. And so I think there's going to be a combination of different attempts. One thing that actually my advisor Andrew Ng told me is, like, he said, don't even worry about the older professors changing their mind. They won't. They're not, like, if you're an economist who had like built their entire career on really solid, provably like optimal, very simple statistical models, you're not going to start in your 60s to learn how to program some large like reinforcement learning model, and then really dig deep into all this new kind of math and all the new tooling and running all this infrastructure and starting to apply for, you know, massive computing grants and so on to run this. This is just not going to happen. The way you will change that field is with the young folks, the folks who are just starting their masters, their PhDs, and to inspire them with a vision that's exciting for them, and that, you know, also changes depending on different people. But a lot of PhDs do want to have high impact. They want to be part of a beginning wave, because if you're part of the beginning of a wave, you're just going to have way more citations, and that will reflect really well for your academic career. And, you know, for me, like, I'm like the fourth most cited person now in the entire field of natural language processing. There's sort of two particle physicists, and then there's my advisor, who's the number one, Chris Manning, in NLP. And that would have been impossible if I had just done what everyone else was doing, which is like some graphical models, some conditional random field modifications, or latent Dirichlet allocation types of models, directed and undirected graphical models. That would have been impossible. And so as an academic, and this has got to encourage you, I don't know all the names here, but I'm sure there are a lot of young up and coming PhD students in here in the audience. I encourage you to think about what's the next wave that you could be part of starting. And that, to me, is reinforcement learning and economics, and broadly construed also human interactions. You know, interestingly enough, just I think this week we had another new result from DeepMind come in. They play a game, Strategio. I actually didn't know the game before, like a board game. And while I generally don't think board games are that interesting to play, this one is actually more interesting than most others, because you have incomplete information, and you actually have to have natural language processing as part of a negotiation and as part of convincing others to do something. And I think that's highly relevant to what we're doing here also with climate change. So
Right,
I
there
go
was
on
also
for a long time.
diplomacy. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, there was Stratego. There's also Cicero. But in a sense, like, we will actually have a reading group with the inventor of one of the project leads of Cicero next week.
That's awesome.
We'll plug for that. Yeah. So another aspect here is that obviously climate change and sustainability, as you alluded to, it's a very big social issue, right? So in this competition, we're asking people to think about some, cool technical solution, but also think about the social ramifications and social aspects of their solution. So you're also an advisor to this competition. So what would you like teams to do or to think about in terms of social aspects and impact when they submit their solution? What are some things they should really be thinking about?
So I would really work hard on getting the simulation to be as realistic as possible, and try to, especially in the US, like, everything unfortunately gets politicized a lot. So try to be as realistic as you can about the assumptions that you're putting in, and as apolitical and as scientific as possible with the assumptions that you put into the simulation. And then and then try to make it more realistic and actually spend a good amount of cycles on the setup and the structure. And then, of course, try to see if you can incorporate as much data as you can into your simulation too, past data and realistic assumptions, in this case about industrial growth and emerging markets, and then maybe focus on some of the communities that are the most impacted by climate change, and what they can do, but also what the world as a whole can do. And I think we're seeing more and more willingness of the countries that have benefited from the Industrial Revolution in the last 100 years the most to actually give back to some of the countries that are now impacted the most. And so these kinds of, I don't know if you like reparations and subsidies and support that countries can pay. I think there's also an interesting question, like how are they actually sort of best used to actually mitigate the real changes, and then help those countries not just one-off sort of, oh, we built this one dam and now you still don't know how to build the next dam yourself and things like that, but think about sort of long-term solutions of how those countries can help themselves. Because the Netherlands is going to deal with rising seas as much as Bangladesh, but the Netherlands have like a lot of experience in building amazing dams and dealing with that and growing their country and their land and not losing a lot of it to erosion. And so that is that kind of long-term play that I think the beautiful thing here is that you can actually play out. Imagine if instead of listening to a politician and taking their best guess and their very simple economic models for how to do taxation and subsidies and so on, and instead saying we simulated millions and millions of years of different taxation and subsidy structures. And in 90% of our like millions of years of human and industrial evolutions and revolutions, like here are a few that worked out really well given these outcomes, these ideas for how to structure climate change sort of policies and related policies. And here, like 90% that didn't work, and like we're probably in one of the ones that didn't work as well as the ones that then AI can come up with.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of diversity and complexity in the world, and presenting that and showing that computers can make all these millions comparisons more effectively than humans, that would be very powerful. Which actually leads me to like a question. I mean, right now you're building this new privacy aware search engine, and it's perhaps even more than a search engine if you go to u.com, right? I would argue that you're trying to make AI also accessible in a way, which is actually really interesting sort of bridge to like what we're trying to do here, because you're really communicating or making this technology accessible to real people, right? People who are not, AI researchers. So can you comment, using that experience there, like how would we present these solutions most effectively to to the non-AI audience, right? Like, in what form does it come? Is it a website? Is it an app? What do you have any thoughts on that?
It's a really good question. I actually think as a researcher, I used to feel like this too, and it's very easy to underestimate the importance of communicating your results, and to some degree building excitement, right? And as a researcher, that starts with simple things like in your talk, you'd have a little bit of a narrative arc of like, I tried these things, I tried this thing, this didn't work. And then I had this idea, and now here's the result, versus like, you just kind of say, oh, I worked on these things, this is a method, and here's the result. And you're like, oh, okay. It's like, it's not as exciting, right? This is simple things like this. You can see like how OpenAI, they created a lot of hype in like, oh, we're going to get AGI and so on. They're probably not going to get to AGI, but in the process, they're making a huge amount of progress on real life models. And they had enough conviction to then convince others to then get a ton of funding to then have a lot of impact and to build very large models. And these kinds of models here in AI economics have to be very large too in order to be successful, right? No one's gonna really listen to an economic model that was simulated with like 10 people in the economy, or 2 organizations and not realistic data. And so I would encourage folks to try to create some flashy demos, to not look down on good science communicators as sort of substandard researchers, and try to build some good visualizations of what they're doing, write engaging blog posts, get on Twitter, and spread the word and spread the message. And yeah, ideally have some videos too where they describe their work, and then show impact. I think the problem is that unlike in NLP, where you just have a demo and the demo is either cool or not, or the performance numbers are either amazing or not, there is kind of a big shift here. You almost want to not be beholden to the old benchmarks, where you say, oh, I want this like provably correct one-step economic model, right? Like you have to kind of shift the entire framework for people, and that is harder. And in particular, in your case, like for climate change, it's even harder because the worst effects are going to be, in the future. So you have to really help people visualize how you're able to better make predictions for the future based on these simulations. And that will happen by helping people visualize what's going on in the simulations, and hence, yeah, having very good experiments, experimental tracking, and visualizations of these simulations, and how you interact with them is going to be crucial.
Right. So good visualizations and making them intuitive too, I imagine. Yeah, no, that's great advice. So we're almost half an hour in, so I think we should open it up for audience questions too. So please post any questions you have in the Q&A box, or raise your hand if you want to ask a question live and we can unmute you. We do have 2 questions here already, so maybe we'll get started with those 2. The first one comes from Maximilian. He says he's interested to know what kind of arguments you're appealing to when you state that you want to have 1 million agents to accurately model a country. What kind of scientific basis does it have? And what kind, and then maybe more broadly, what kind of research questions demand having that size? And what questions have accurate answers using less than 1 million agents?
Yeah, 3 questions. So I guess in general, you just want to, like, ideally you get to the exact number of people inside a country, right, that will deal with the outcomes and will, complain about, I don't know, getting taxed really highly for their gasoline, right? And then there's backlash, and then they vote in different politicians who will lower the gas prices, and then you're not going to be as successful. So ultimately, we want to get to billions of people and model every country in the world, and then work through how all these different countries could coordinate on all kinds of things and within themselves, and so on. So that, to me, is the ultimate simulation. It's a simulation that simulates most closely the fact that we have billions of individual intelligent humans on this planet trying to maximize a variety of different objective functions they set for themselves, including survival, reproduction, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and all of that. And so that is sort of where I think the ultimate ideal end state is. And then we can simulate all of that massively, and then try to come up with the best forms for climate change conversations, negotiations, but also like their connection to the entire economy and the different economies and how they interact with one another. And then, of course, you can, so that's sort of the main, I think, sort of first principles way is like the more realistic your simulation is, the better. Like the truth is the world is full of billions of people. So that's where you want to get to, ideally. And then you can say, well, let's not, do all of that. You can do it for one country, and some countries have just a few million people. So that's where we get to that order of magnitude as a step below that. And then you can say, okay, let's make simplifying assumptions and say there are only like 20 like actual countries that are currently negotiating with 20 people who are representing all their countries. And let's assume we can kind of summarize and make it conditionally independent of all the other people that they're representing. And then you can maybe still do interesting things with a few dozen agents that are representing the entire countries, and you would hope have a realistic time frame and whatnot associated with them.
Right. Because to some degree it has to do with how effective simplifying assumptions are and how homogeneous society is perhaps, and sometimes like that doesn't work, right? If the distributions are very non-normal, for instance, I guess.
And oddly enough, in the US, to kind of bimodal, right? And so depending on who's in power for those 4 years, you get a very different climate negotiating partner compared to, the next 4 years.
Right. And we also have some people paramodal more. So that's probably, maybe, I'm not sure if that's the mean of the distribution, but right. Okay, great. All right, so Andrew asks, do you believe that the proximity between policy and academia and economics has anything to do with this resistance to change? So just to contextualize, a lot of economists serve as advisors to politicians and in all kinds of institutional organizations. Yeah, whereas so policymakers and politicians can't really move fast and break things. They're held to a higher standard of accountability. The tech sector has more of an iterative process where they move faster, right? So the tech sector essentially can innovate very quickly, but in politics and perhaps economics, people might be afraid of what a fast innovation might do, right? So do you believe that this? So the question is, do you believe that their resistance to any change or new methodology has something to do with this dynamic?
I think that's certainly a part of it. I think academia is usually structured in different groups, and I don't claim to know all the social dynamics of economists. I know that even as a PhD student, it's not necessarily about all the citations you have in a PhD in economics, but it's usually like you have 1 or 2 working papers, and then it's your letter of recommendation from your advisor that determines whether you get a faculty job. At least that's what it was a couple of years ago. Maybe things have changed since, and talked to just a couple of PhDs in economics at Stanford and Princeton and a few other places. But that already kind of tells you that it's not yet just about, oh, this person has clearly made a huge breakthrough advance, but it is more about this old person says this young person is really good and aligned with their thoughts to a bunch of other old people. And then they decide whether this young person should have an amazing career in their field. So that, I think, is as big of an issue as this direct connection to policy. Now, you're 100% right that like policymakers can't just move fast and break things. Though interestingly enough, even that is on a global scale, we kind of see a spectrum. In some ways, the US actually has there's this one spectrum that you can think about, which is litigation versus legislation. In the US, very often, outside of obvious exceptions like the FDA and drug trials where you can't just sell snake oil and kill people, but in a lot of cases, companies can try something quickly, and then if it actually starts to hurt people, they will sue. Then they will create a lawsuit. Then that will create sort of a case. And then it's sort of this case-based law that comes of like, oh, because we decided like this in this case, which may go all the way to Supreme Court, then like this kind of becomes the law afterwards. Whereas in Europe, they are much further away from the litigation and much closer to legislation. They're trying to legislate and regulate things before they might even have an impact, right? Like AI, they're all looking at China and be like, oh, we don't want people to get have like social scores, which honestly are not really that much of an AI system. It's just a simple database, or you can just have if they do this, you plus 5, and if they do that, minus 10. But people are scared of that, and so they want to legislate that before that could even happen. And unfortunately, sometimes they're a little bit overeager in legislating. Like AI, especially in the abstract, which I don't think makes sense. It makes sense to legislate it in the concrete applications and industries. just like computers. Like if you think of AI as technology or AI as computers, you also realize it doesn't make sense to legislate all computers, but it does make sense to legislate like child pornography on the internet, right? Like that makes sense. But all of computers, like at the TCP/IP level, makes less sense. And so as AI affects real people, you want to legislate it more carefully. So long story short, I would like to see in academia a broad spectrum of research in economics. And some folks are way out there in terms of timescales, and others are like very applied and very close to existing policies. And we see this in similar fields that are struggling to really make a huge dent, such as neuroscience, right? We try to understand the brain, and there are different schools of how to understand the brain. Like there's like computational neuroscientists, there are theoretical neuroscientists, they're super applied, and they're clinical people, right? That are like directly doing brain surgeries in that moment. And they can't just say, oh, well, I read this like really beautiful, like computational neuroscience paper. That doesn't change how they're going to do that procedure the next week for a patient who has epilepsy and is constantly in huge amounts of pain. But the field as a whole should have these different timescales that they're working on. And honestly, if you put a lot of effort behind this, I don't even think the timescales here are insanely long. It's not like this field will need 10 years before it could have real impact. I think it could have real impact in the next few years if we scale these models up quickly.
Right. Yeah. So, and I think what I hear a little bit, if I read between the lines a little bit, is that there needs to be a tighter feedback loop between like what policymakers are legislating about versus what is actually possible. And the more concrete things we can look at and legislate about, the more effective it might be versus like being more abstract. Okay, great. So Leonie, so it's a Dutch name, so it's a Dutch name, so I use Dutch pronunciation. I'm not actually sure how Americans would pronounce it. Leonie asks, from my personal experience, assumptions play a big role in the outcomes of economic models. Would AI-based simulation require the same kinds of assumptions as current macroeconomic models? And would the effects these assumptions have be as obvious to policymakers as with simpler models?
I love that question because it's so spot on. The beautiful thing, I think, is that you have sort of this distinctions between micro and macro economics, but really the micro assumptions about one particular person, company, or organization will play into, I think, the macro if you had a large enough simulation that correctly models all of that. And so what I think is beautiful about this is that absolutely these assumptions will play a big role in the outcomes. There's no doubt about it. But you can actually very concretely map them and say, look, we assume that the utility curve for someone falls, like is sampled from this prior distribution, right? And you sample a bunch of them, and each person may have a different utility curve. Some people are willing to work 996, like from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, and they're willing to do that. And other people are not. They're like really would prefer to work 9 to 5, 3 days a week, 4 days a week, right? And then entire countries will adjust to some of these different models and so on. And so these, depending on different assumptions about the distribution of different people falling along different types of utility curves and so on, will actually impact your model. And so why I think that's beautiful in the simulations is that you can kind of map that out and say, look, if we assume people fall on this kind of distribution of how much they'd want to work or how they think about collaboration versus just their own preferences and things like that, how long-term time horizons they have themselves in planning, all of that, we can then come to different outcomes. And then you can kind of say, well, now let's look at these assumptions and just, again, collect more data and see where people actually fall in these assumptions that go into the model. And then if we can, that is actually a little bit less of a political question, and it can be answered better with more data and carefully sort of run experiments and questions and analyses. And then I think that would help us basically make people believe in the outcomes of the simulation more.
Right. So, and in fact, in a way, I think what you're saying is the simulations and AI allow you to make more realistic assumptions that are backed by data rather than just somebody sitting in an armchair coming up with those assumptions. Okay, next question is, Anonymous says, thanks for the great talk. Well, you're welcome. The AI economist is really well formulated because the simulation is grounded by existing economics models. However, in fields where this may not be as accessible, but there is a lot of data, how can we still show that what was learned is grounded in a real model or a realistic model, I imagine?
Right. So I struggle a little bit with that question. Thanks. I'm glad you enjoyed the talk. In the sense that, like, if there is a lot of data, you would hope that that grounds it. So I guess, but yeah, it's maybe not grounded in existing economic models, but it is grounded in a lot of data. So, and it sort of connects actually to Lena's next question, which is, yeah, we'll get to it, I guess, in a second. But I think you're indeed right. It's harder. I don't know if I have a perfect answer of like, this is how you're going to make it less hard. I do think you're going to want to get as much data as you can, and then be as explicit as you can about your different assumptions. And if different people actually disagree with the assumptions, just run the model multiple times. You're like, oh, you think this assumption happens? I think this assumption is what's going to happen. It's a curve. Sometimes it's hard to extrapolate curves into the future. Let's just run it with different curves and then show that the outcomes are positive, or what the outcomes could be as they're different, and then be upfront about about the uncertainty that you have when it comes to like potentially different outcomes based on different inputs.
Right. Yeah, I think there's always a push and pull between what's the model, what's the data say, and what assumptions do you make. Yeah, let's go to Alina's question, because that one is perhaps a bit on the point. So Alina asks, even if we find that a policy is the most optimal globally, we humans are greedy and each country might only think about their own profit in the short term. How can you deal with this? The open question, I guess.
That is, it is kind of an age-old question for humanity. I think you would hope that for something that is optimal globally, countries will be able to come together. And if it is actually optimal globally, then some countries will actually benefit from it, right? And so you kind of then have to do the politics of it and have the organizations that either believe in it and are strong enough and powerful enough, and maybe in some ways have enough leeway with their current constituents and people and so on, to try to convince everyone that this is the right thing to do. Like European Union and Germany are paying, I think now, some countries that are impacted by climate change money to mitigate that climate change. And they don't like legally have to right away, but they realize that this is a fair thing to do. And so when, I would like to think that not everyone is only greedy for their own country, and some countries are thinking slightly more globally and long-term. But yeah, you have to first convince, and this is often an easy mistake to make, and I made it myself very often too, which is you spend a lot of time on the people that are most critical of your approach, rather than really spending the time of the people who like your approach to make them really, really big fans and then contributors, and help you kind of grow your ecosystem. And this is true for a small startup, right? You have like a few users that complain a bunch, and it's good to listen to them, but it's also important to make sure that the people who really love it, that they love it even more, and then tell everyone else how much they love it, rather than have a few detractors and prevent them from saying bad things or something about them not liking it. And so I think the same is true for academia, and the same is true in politics at a high level and in these global negotiations. And so I do think enough countries have now come around to realizing various issues around climate change and are trying to mitigate it together. And then, of course, at some point, like if everyone, like if the majority of folks agree that this is the right thing to do, a bunch of the folks in that majority will actually benefit from an optimal global model. Then and this, I guess, ambiguous global, it's both global and in the globe, and global in terms of like global maximums or something, and policies, which are kind of elusive, but at least like in the experimental settings and samples. But basically, at some point, you just have to like use other economic levers to try to convince folks, like you don't get as much international trade or something, and you get higher taxes or tariffs or various other economic sanctions and whatnot, that sort of different levers to try to get folks to work together. I guess in politics, I'm not the biggest expert on all of those, and this is kind of in the abstract, but I think that's what I would think.
Right. Yeah, no, that's great. So I'll paraphrase Phil's next question. Essentially, he's saying, the AI economist implements a tax policy that is similar to the SAS formula, maybe perhaps not entirely the same, but politicians are not really itching to implement any sort of SAS tax. It's too theoretical, perhaps, or too abstract. Why do you think they'll be more prone to using AI-derived policies if they
Great
don't like,
question.
these math questions anyway? So
I love that question, Philip. I think the main reason is that the SAS formula is sort of provably correct in a one-step economy. And indeed, the AI economist can derive the similar optimal solution for that one step, but then it is way more realistic afterwards. And so I think the way to convince more tax policy folks is not by directly going to the president right now and say, hey, this is my like AI model, like you gotta implement it, right? It's like, it's gonna take some time to convince researchers in the field of economics that this is a reasonable approach. Then you create some hype and some interest in the general press, and have sort of science journalists talk about these models and talk about why they're interesting and how they're making interesting sort of come to interesting conclusions based on communicating that. Then politicians and other journalists will read about it. Then policymakers that are more on the applied side in the field of research will start to see these models. Then they will start listening to them. Then you make the simulations more and more realistic, so that people are saying like, oh, why should I listen to this? It's only, it's simulated only 1,000 people, but we have millions of people. And then you actually do at some point have to listen to them. And that's what we did in like deep learning for natural language processing too. They're like, oh, these models are like almost state of the art, but they're not yet state of the art. So my like manual feature engineering still worked better. And then we just had to collect more data, and then totally, obviously outperform the existing models in these various benchmarks. And so over time, you get more and more young people to start using this technology, these ideas. They will start writing the papers, and then you get to the more applied folks in the field, and then you kind of listen to some of their criticisms, right? And you iterate together scientifically, and in some ways engineering-wise too, and you get rid of the various issues that they may have about, oh, you put this assumption. It's like, well, let's change that assumption and rerun the model. Or it's not big enough, you just have to scale it up, and that is going to be a hard engineering task. So it has to probably be interdisciplinary, because most economics sort of departments won't have the computing infrastructure to run these models. So you probably will have to combine with either companies that have research arms or CS departments and so on to work together.
Right. All right, we have 2 minutes left, so hopefully we can answer one more question before we wrap. And I think this might be a good last question. So Niranjana asks, how important is it to include non-quantifiable factors like emotion, social and cultural preferences, relative power dynamics, trust, and so on in the model? How much do they contribute to building a realistic simulation?
Great question. I think we now have AI that also beats the best poker players. And just like in those kinds of simulations, you need to start incorporating that, and allow the AI agents to at some point cheat and lie and get more realistic sort of assumptions about human behavior. And the beautiful thing is that, again, because these are AI models and they learn and they can adapt, they will actually identify strategies to outcompete and outmaneuver other AI systems. And I think that's kind of why they will work better, because AI can also find creative and weird solutions sometimes that even humans didn't think of, and can kind of try to cheat in whichever way they can. Like we saw this in the AI Economist, where you had resources and you can build houses to block those resources. Some AIs, some individual agents actually identified the strategy to block the resources so they can have them only to themselves, and others couldn't. And so I think these are actually things you can and probably should incorporate into that world, and then they will like kind of emerge, like trust will emerge from which agents will be lying or not lying, and then other agents interacting with those, and then having to build sort of their own prior distributions over whether they can even trust the fact that they got from another agent and all of that. And you kind of start doing that by, again, like sampling from some distribution where you say, well, maybe I have some distribution over like how truthful the statements are from each actor, and those are, again, also kind of fundamental assumptions about human psychology and human nature that you can try to incorporate into these models, and then let it all play out.
Yeah. So that's very comprehensive, right? And I think that this is in fact one of these open research challenges where that's why we also have to rely on a lot of ingenuity of the people in the room and anyone who's watching and anyone who's participating. So we're at the hour now, so I think we unfortunately have to wrap it here, for today. Thank you again, Richard, so much for being here, for taking the time to to answer all these questions. You're a very, very busy man these days. You've always been very busy, but maybe especially so now. So thank you so much for being here. Thanks everyone for attending. I hope you got a lot of inspiration from this talk. Just a brief plug for the next two events. We'll have a reading group with Noam Brown, who's gonna have a similar Q&A about Cicero next Monday. That's like the recent diplomacy AI result that's really relevant to this competition. And then also we'll have another Q&A with Vincent Konitzer, who's an expert on game theory and math and AI. So hope you'll tune in for that. All the announcements will be on Twitter and other social media and Slack. So thanks so much for being here today, and see you soon. All right.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and thanks for all your great questions. It's always tough to give a talk when you just have a few names in a list, but from those questions, it was clear that folks were very engaged, and really appreciate it. Thanks a bunch. Have a great one.
Yeah, appreciate your time, Richard. Thank you so much. All right, thanks all. Bye.